As Seth gave me a nice introduction there, talking about the concept of open source intelligence, or OSINT, and how we can apply it as blue teamers. Now, when Micah developed this course, he asked me to be one of the instructors for the course, and I said, that's great, Micah, but I'm not a pen tester. I don't do that kind of stuff. How does that really apply to me? And so as I started to look at the material, I said, you know, there's a lot of applications to this as a blue teamer, which is what I am. And so just a little bit about me as we go through. I am a certified instructor for the SANS Institute. I am a GSE, unfortunately not a 2-digit GSE. I'm in a 3-digit, but that's okay. All right, I like to think of myself as a security mule. You say, what does that really mean? Well, mule is something that gets the job done. Perseveres, carries the load, handles it through, occasionally gets whipped, but most of the time gets to take care of what needs to be done. And of course, I've got my primary role, which is that of father, husband, taking care of my kids. And these my crew here. I've got 3 of them, 1 in college, 2 in high school. Could not be more proud of them. But let's go ahead and really talk about what we're dealing with open source intelligence. Okay? And this is really the concept of harvesting data from these publicly available sources. Now, we like to do that without having this really deep interaction with the targets. We want them to be able to collect this data without them necessarily know we're collecting it, right? We want to have that operational security, but it's not just about going out and running that Google search. We are bringing value to this to take it from data and to turn it into intelligence. I can go out, anyone can go out, run a Google search and get something out. But have I corroborated that data? Have I done some sort of enrichment to make it more useful to my environment? And have I taken and distilled it into something that is useful in my operations? And that's really the concept we're talking about in OSINT, is going from search to collation to analysis out to that actual end product, which is the intelligence. Okay? Now, there are lots of resources out there. I've got a couple shown on the slide here. I've got a logo that Micah put together for his OSINT Curious project. So it's a group of OSINTers who do this as part of their jobs, whether it's investigation or whether it's pen testing. And they have lots of wonderful resources out there. I have a series of these 10-minute tips, essentially some videos they've recorded. We can go and look for particular topics of interest related to OSINT. Now, we also have things like the OSINT framework put together by a gentleman named Justin Nordine. It has a list of resources you can use. I have a particular piece of data. How do I take that data and turn it into something else? How do I make it useful for my particular set of operations? And many of the resources that are linked through the things like the OSINT framework, they are free, which is great. We like free. However, it is often the case that maybe rate limited, maybe it has an API, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it has certain things that are free, but if you want the good stuff, you got to pay something. Okay, so we have different challenges we have as we're collecting this data. And really it comes down to getting out of this offensive-oriented mindset. You mentioned, hey, sorry, this isn't the red team presentation, right? But we see this is why we think of OSINT as a red team operation. We see it in the pen testing frameworks. We see it in the kill chain trademark, right? So we know that this is thought of as an offensive operation because our adversaries are out there collecting information. They're doing scans. They're doing searches. They're collecting data on the target before they ever engage. Well, interesting. However, really, wouldn't we want to know the same thing about ourselves, right? We want to know what we present to the outside world. Okay? Now, we talk about visibility. We talk about having logs and having access to all these different things, these different data sources that concern our environments. That's great. That's fantastic. But what about the data that we don't see? What about the information about us that's not collected in our SIM? Well, that's really where OSINT comes into play, because the same types of tools that are used by pen testers, that are used by your network admins, those have value in your defensive operations. So I wanted to take a look at this and say, not just speak in the abstract and talk about tools, let's look at it through the lens of a couple different defensive scenarios. Okay, and so I put together a couple different thoughts here, and these are things we've touched on throughout the week already with some different presentations. So things like compromised credentials. Okay? That's a thing. Compromised, what is it Randy said yesterday? If it's inside my network, it's a compromise. If it goes out, it's a breach. Well, we're going to be dealing with the reality of compromised credentials because we know that even though MFA is there for us, it's not always going to be enabled. So it's going to remain a problem. And as we move more services out to the cloud and they become ubiquitous and available, of course, we have ease of access by your adversary where they can sit and bang on your Office 365 tenant all day long. Of course, moving from compromise to breach, look at the data we have. We mentioned about data being really the perimeter, what we care about. And so we want to know, are things I care about out there in the wild? Now, other things. This is an interesting target. Encryption certificates. We think of those as items that we normally control. But what if someone else is issuing certificates for your organization's domain? Would you know that? There was a case posted by Cisco Talos, talk about domain shadowing, where adversaries were breaking in, taking control of DNS records, typically hosted at services like GoDaddy. So it's organizations that were smaller, they're outsourcing that type of operation. And the adversaries would simply create subdomains and host within those subdomains and use those to operate the CNC and deliver the malware associated with their exploit kits. Okay, we know traffic's encrypted. Adversaries like encryption just as much as we do. So can we track those issuance of certificates without having that traffic have to cross our sensors? Right? OSINT comes into play here. And then finally, the big gorilla we have, which is social media. We know that there are corporate presence for your organizations in social media. And of course, we have individuals who have their own social media accounts who are posting things about your organization. How can we track that? And we know that's a vector by which adversaries may target that layer 8 vulnerability. Right? They're looking at your people, targeting them for phishing, for social engineering. Well, how do we track all these things? So we have a lot of different use cases here that are applicable to our operations that don't cleanly fall into our normal logging process. So how can we get this data into our process? We'll start with our big challenge, which is compromised credentials. And we know that password reuse happens. Right? It's not if, it is very much when. People will get compromised. I worked a case previously, I want to say it's coming up on a year ago, where our CFO was targeted. Business email compromise. Adversaries got in. They sat in his account for almost a week, watched. And then when he was traveling, they took his email box. They basically set a forwarding rule to disable all incoming messages and started a conversation trying to initiate a wire transfer. And we fortunately caught it because we had strong financial controls. What we didn't have is, well, we didn't have MFA fully rolled out then. We didn't have that real good monitoring in place for those key players. If we had been watching, though, maybe that's something we'd have caught before I got to that point. However, we went back and we did the investigation and realized, well, did this breach come from internally? No. Third-party site. We used the password somewhere else. They used it to get into his Office 365, and all the badness started from there. Okay? So how would we know if these types of things were out there? How would we know if your organization, your individuals are involved in a particular credential compromise? We can start out simple web searches. Troy Hunt, researcher at Microsoft, has maintained this project for many years. It is haveibeenpwned.com. Very simple web interface, free to use. Good. Okay, but again, searching one-off doesn't really scale, right? I mean, I guess unless you have a sufficient number of interns, maybe before they get snatched up by Google, you can put them to work, typing in, seeing what's going on all day long. Doesn't really scale, okay? So how about some automation? How about an API, okay? And so because I don't want to have a substandard stock, I have written a simple script here to query that API and say, hey, by the way, why don't you tell me if I have a particular account that's been associated with a breach? So in this case, a simple query via the public API. It's free, but rate limited. And it allows me to pull that data back in JSON. If I have data in JSON, what can I do? Well, let's see, I can script this up. I can iterate through. I can dump it out somewhere. I can consume it in Splunk or whatever my other choice is, whether it's Elastic or whatever else. And now I've got data that's easy to read and now it's started to be operationalized. Okay? And what's the flaw with this particular approach? What's the only thing we've got here that we might not like to have? If you take a look, if you notice the API query, it's talking about one account. Okay? And if you look at the API for have I been pwned, it doesn't really give the opportunity to look at it at a domain level. Okay? So that's bad, because generally I'd like to know all the things. However, they do have a domain search you can get to through the web interface. However, there's some validation around this particular feature. They want you to verify you actually own the domains for which you are putting in these searches and alerts. So this is a nice way to, for them to help protect us a little bit, but still goes back to this manual process where now I'm probably getting something alerted via email, and, well, we know email alerts. When my workflow depends on email, that typically makes me want to go into like a Hulk smashing rage, because that doesn't really flow, right? I want it to be something where I pull the data down in an automated fashion. And sure, I could pull an email box, but if I can script it, that would be much more of my preference. Okay? Other things we can do to kind of follow along that scripting thought is we could use a framework. In this case, the open source ReconNG framework by Tim Tomes is an option. It has a module that can, again, query this have I been pwned API for us. That's great, okay? And it basically works off this concept of data transformation. We feed it a seed value, and from that seed value, it goes and pivots into other types of information. In this case, we feed it an email account. Once it has the email account, it can run and tell us, hey, by the way, does this appear anywhere else in this breach data? Helpful. Other part, structured data storage. There's a SQLite database where the results of this output will be stored. And I can take that, again, export to whatever format I want, ingest into my SIM, and now I've got some automation built out, right? Because I can pre-populate in the database, in the SQLite, all the accounts I care about. Maybe I'm starting with my C-suite or key players. Or what was the other one we talked about? Oh, the admins, right? Your network admins or your privileged users. I might really be interested to see what they're doing, since only 1.7% of them enable MFA. Do that, and now I've got the makings of a workflow, but you say, you know, cool story. However, I see a framework here. I see something I'm running interactively. Yes, you do, but we can also script it. So now I can take this script, this scripting interface, I can give it an RC file, or I can give it parameters on the command line. Now I can drop it in cron or whatever your task scheduler is, and now I can automate the whole thing. Everything from the running of the query to the export of the data, where I can drop it where it'll be properly ingested into my SIM, and now that's something which I can use to alert on in real time. Okay? Well, what's the dependency we have now? We're counting on have I been pwned to stay up to date, right? So it allows us to monitor that service. We're counting on that service to stay up to date. However, understand this is truly a white hat service. This is not a case like Pwn List or some of these other historical services that would actually give you the password or the hash. In this case, it'd say, hey, this is involved in a breach. We want to know. How does it know? Well, what it does is it actually, unlike services like dhashed, where you can actually get those hashes, some interesting things here. This is where you're kind of crossing from that clear white defensive side to, hey, by the way, this will give you the actual password representation. Interesting. You have to see if that fits with your corporate ethics, with what you're allowed to do. But you can go in and do searches across things like usernames and passwords. You can also do things like search on a hash. So if I search on a hash, get multiple hits, now I've got something very interesting, because I know, probably unsalted, right? If I can search on a hash and get that hit in multiple places, unsalted hash, and also tells me all the places it occurs. So it actually lets you delve in a little bit deeper there to things that maybe we don't necessarily directly use in security operations. That is a paid service. Okay? So different model. However, when we're thinking of things like have I been pwned, we like to stay on top of it, and it does so by doing some automated scraping of things like paste sites. And so it's a paste site. It's a place where I can just simply put up almost any arbitrary blob of text. And we often associate things like paste sites with breaches, but have I been pwned is set up to monitor this particular Twitter feed called @dumpmon. and it'll announce these, hey, I think I found something that looks like a breach. Have a Pastebin to go out and scrape that location automatically, and it says at times within seconds, within 40 seconds to a minute, it may have ingested that data already to see, hey, by the way, I've got new records that may be associated with the breach. So it's a near real-time operation. Very helpful to us as a defender. Solving a problem is if we have a loss of something that we don't monitor, well, now we've got a way to start monitoring that. Okay? But beyond credential dumps, of course, things like paste sites are places where other information that we care about may end up. So it's not just credential dumps. Okay? Now I've got anybody recognize this logo? LulzSec, that's right. And LulzSec was kind of the one that propelled Pastebin up into more prominence as being a repo for breach dumps. The Fox and the other types of breach data that ended up there, they were very active for a while, not so much recently after they kind of found their way into the crosshairs of law enforcement. However, we're still talking about concern of sensitive data. Now we're broadening it just from credentials to all sorts of sensitive data. So how can we track that? Well, we can certainly leverage some of the specific features available in the sites. So things like Pastebin being one of the most prominent, we have the ability to register as a user. You can purchase an account, I think it's like $5, and you can set up keyword alerts. Okay? Not perfect, but it's better. It helps us. But the problem, again, being a problem of scope. So leveraging my OSINT, I'm looking at one site. How many paste sites are there? I'm pretty sure there's more than just one, right? There's actually quite a few. So what can we do? Well, we can leverage some of the other resources out there as well. In this case, we're looking at a site, and if you're into OSINT, Michael Bazel's Intel Technique site's a fantastic resource for you because it gives you ready-made web forms to use. And when you go to these forms and do the search, the nice part about it is it doesn't actually go through his systems. You load up the page, it gives you an input box, but it's actually all driven by JavaScript. So you can open up the page source, you can look at it and realize it's only going to originate from you. So it helps you preserve some of your operational security and, of course, allows you to look and see what they're doing, and then you can set it up on your own. In this case, he has a custom page search that goes across 57 different sites. Okay? Now, again, 57 sites may or may not be a comprehensive view, but it's a pretty good cross-section of what you got going on. And going back to that perfect solution fallacy, it's better visibility than we had before. If we weren't looking there before, now we've got visibility across things we may care about. Okay? And it really is just using a Google custom search engine on the back end, which basically means if you want to do it yourself, you can certainly do so. Now the question is, what am I giving away from an OPSEC perspective? Well, I'm telling Google, to some extent, what I care about, what keywords, what things I may be working on. And so this is always the balance we have to think about is if I'm using a third-party service, well, by definition, by giving them data that I want them to monitor, kind of telling them what I really care about. Okay? However, it may not be that necessarily big a deal, or maybe we can keep things generic, but ultimately we have the option to go there and create our own custom search engine, and then we can invoke that and simply make a call, script those calls to that engine, whether it's getting it through an API key or through scraping the output. Either way, you have options to invoke that with the search across sites you care about. Now, if you want to go even broader, of course, you can go through things like Google Alerts. I can go set up an alert, and essentially it'll search across the entire web to tell me, hey, by the way, you're looking for these particular keywords. Of these keywords, what are the things that I care about? Okay? You can get alerts via email. And again, going back to that OPSEC consideration is how much data do I want to entrust to this third party? So I've got the option to enter these particular search terms. However, they may not always be things I want to share outside my organization, right? Not appropriate for some high security environments, maybe not appropriate for highly regulated industries, but depending on your model, it may be good enough to help you get insight into things you care about. Okay? Now, certificate tracking is an interesting thought because, again, we want to know where certificates issued in our organization's name were used. Okay? So we think, okay, well, I'll simply go to my CA, look and see what I've issued, what I've purchased, right? However, if my domain has in some way been subverted, someone else has the opportunity to issue those certificates in my name. Think about Let's Encrypt. Anybody use Let's Encrypt in here? Really? Okay, I've got one back here. So when I use Let's Encrypt and I set up the cert bot agent, what's the only thing I have to do for the initial issuance of a certificate? That's right. I just have to have the ability to have it point to my host via DNS. But if an adversary has subverted your DNS and maybe created a new subdomain and you're not aware of it, are you going to see that request? Let's see. I broke into your GoDaddy hosting account. I went to your DNS page, created a new child domain, pointed it to my infrastructure that's in Kazakhstan or wherever, and no offense to any Kazakhs, but that would never cross your monitors. So your DNS logging, which, hey, don't get me wrong, I love DNS logging, very powerful. But if I don't log it, if I don't see it, it doesn't really do me any good. So they have the ability to issue these certificates in my name. How would I know if that's been done? And what we get to there is certificate transparency. Okay? This is relatively recent phenomena where we see now that CAs are required to report up the certificates they've issued. And so now that data is searchable for us. Fantastic. And in this case, we see the logo at the top is really just a link to the Certificate Transparency Project that says, hey, by the way, this is what we're about. And if you want to download the entire log, all the records of all the certificates been issued, both current and expired, you can do so there. Or you can go to pretty much any certificate authority. You can go to Google. You can go to Facebook. They all have interfaces for you to do this search on certificate transparency. So again, I can go back and say, hey, I would like you to tell me every certificate that's been issued in my domain's name, either full domain or partial match. So now we have that use case where the items that were not perhaps visible to me, like those compromised subdomains, now if the attacker is using HTTPS, which is the norm, right? What is our percentage of encrypted traffic these days? 75, 80% for the web, right, or more? Okay, so it's very likely they're going to be leveraging things like HTTPS, which means certificates, which means now we have an opportunity to view something related to us that never crosses our sensors. Okay? So an example of one of the things you might see at one of the CAs, so this certificate transparency search tool allows you to go through, whether you're using Entrust or DigiCert or whatever CA, fill in the blank, you can go find their web interface, do some searching for it, and from there, you can set up the monitoring of that, right? Again, make a simple web call, automate it, whether it's via curl, whether it's via PowerShell, whatever tool you prefer in your environment, you can set up these automated calls to look, pull back that data, and do some scraping. Now, other options you may have. This is a different way of looking at certificates, moving away from certificate transparency and talking about things that are doing the web type enumeration, large-scale scanning. So most of us are familiar with things like Shodan, right? So Census is very similar to Shodan, a little bit different in that it's not necessarily aimed at IoT. It is generally aimed at the internet. It does regular scan, a little more aggressive about pruning out its records, but in this case, it'll also capture certificate details. So it'll pull down that metadata from the certificates, store it, and make it searchable. So that gives us a major advantage over things we may see in other search engines. And there's other projects like crt.sh. There are other options for doing the search, whatever fits you. Now, crt.sh, I've got an example of the web interface here. But I like Census because Census has an API. And if we have API, we have automation. Okay? And so we can pull back. In this example, I see I've used a web interface to pull down some certificate data. And that certificate data is related to, for example, SANS.org issuing these certificates for isc.sans.edu. Okay? You can do this all, as we've shown before, make a RESTful web call, pull it back via JSON, ingest it in your SIEM, and now you have searchable data. If you have searchable data, you have alertable data. Right? So those are all playing to our strengths as a blue team operation. Okay? Now, the one part that we hadn't quite gotten to yet is the idea of social media. Okay? So that's another area we like to monitor. Yet we don't have visibility into those logs. We may see that encrypted traffic going out across our sensors to social media, if that's permitted in our environment, but we don't know the content unless we're cracking it open. And just curious, show of hands, who's actually doing SSL interception? Okay, right, so I see some definites and some right, and so we know that that's a challenging proposition, right, because there's always going to be some pushback or things like that, even though we like to have the visibility, like to see what's going on, although we saw as our presentation this morning, we don't always have to have that full packet content in order to know what's happening, but we would like to have some idea of what's going on at these sites because we know that's a place where people tend to overshare. Or they maybe post things negatively about your organization. Or perhaps they are posting data or sharing things inappropriately. Or perhaps they are being tracked in some way to facilitate future types of attacks. Things like social engineering or phishing, because any adversary can go out and find people in your organization and start to pull that data together. So this screenshot is from an incident I worked earlier this year where we had someone say, hey, you know what? I've seen this strange social media profile starting to connect. And so we were monitoring these things on LinkedIn. And we had this lovely profile of this young lady ostensibly working in our San Francisco office. Pro tip, we don't have a San Francisco office. Okay? So that's kind of clue number one. And we looked at it and said, okay, this looks interesting. This is some sort of pretextual attack. This person is trying to make connections. And you can see they already have some success. If we see down here, the 5 connections, if you look at the connections she had, there were already connections with people inside the organization. And so they had already started to try to build up this halo effect. Oh, okay, well, I see you're connected with a dozen people inside here. You must be legit, therefore I'll connect to you. What kind of things do you get to see when you're connected to someone in LinkedIn? Well, I can see where you work. I can see your work history, the things that you choose to share. Most of the time, it's all the other items that were not part of your public profile. So typically, job title, work location, things like email address as well. Or you can actually do an export of the LinkedIn data once you have someone as a connection. And you can pull down all the information that's in their profile. Okay? Now, the other thing you can find here is this automatic suggestions from social media. In this case, we say, well, if I'm really, as an adversary, trying to pivot to someone else, when I went to this previous page, of course, I got this suggestion list. And what I see in the suggestion list that's now on the left side of the slide were people in the organization who may be of interest. Now, I've redacted many of the names and kind of covered over the faces, but at the bottom you say, hey, by the way, you may want to connect with this person, and this person happens to be a treasury analyst. Now, in your organization, I don't know what a treasury analyst does. You know what in my organization that person does? They're the ones who send the money out. So now we see that idea of being able to link and track into people to set up these pretextual attacks. We want to know about these things. Okay? Now, we take a look at our profile here, and in addition to the phony-looking location, look at that picture, and I said, you know, that doesn't really strike me as a professional profile. No offense, but so we did a reverse image search. Pro tip, when you're doing reverse image searches on things at work, sometimes the reverse image search doesn't always go the way you think it's going to go, right? So yes, you may find that it falls into that not safe for work category, especially if it's let's just say if it's an attractive-looking young lady, it may actually end up going to things that would definitely trigger those web filters. So just leave it at that. Now, in this case, we did a reverse image search after determining, hey, this is definitely sketchy, and I found it was actually just linked in the notes. It's just a wallpaper. Someone just taken it and cropped it down. We were able to find that and say, okay, we know this is definitely phony, reported it, and started going back and tracing back who else is this connected to, when did you see it, looking for other things. And so, again, LinkedIn, like most social media, has an API. So we can go through that API, we can do call-outs, we can do searches for connections within our organization, people who are claiming to be an organization. Again, automating this data, again, this may not be where you choose to spend all your time as a defender, but certainly want to have some sense of what's going on if we're concerned about things like phishing or other types of social engineering. Certainly a good way to keep mining that data, pulling in additional data sources for things that really never would have crossed our environment otherwise. Right. So hopefully, if we take a look through those kind of 4 different use cases for OSINT, we see that it has very broad applicability for us as defenders. Okay. Now, we can use it to find things where they don't belong, whether it's credential dumps, whether it's sensitive corporate data. We have the opportunities to set up that type of monitoring and alerting. And of course, we can automate that, pull it back into our environment so that now we're not necessarily dependent on a third-party service to tell us, but we can control what gets alerted and when and how. Okay? And of course, it's giving us that same visibility that an external party would have of our organization. Again, if we're not going to do that look into the profile we present, I can assure you someone else is doing it for us. They are giving us that value add. They just kind of forgot to ask for permission. But that's kind of the way it goes. And of course, as I mentioned, this really helps us in cases where we may not have instrumentation in those environments because we don't control them, because we're increasingly consuming SaaS and things like that, where maybe we have limited ability to get that data back into our traditional systems. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your attention.